Hey everyone, welcome back to the Broken Brain. Once again, I am Dwight. Once again, currently and consistently, I am Dwight, your host. Glad to be back with all of you. And I'm also super excited and glad to be with Dr. Trachman. Dr. Susan Trachman is a forensic psychiatrist. And I'm really jazzed about this because we haven't had a full episode talking about forensic work and things like that. It's something that I think a lot of people, obviously, maybe everyone has heard of. A lot of people think they know something about it, and some people actually know something about it. And you're one of those people. So excited to have you come on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, tell everybody, let's start out a little bit. Do you want to introduce yourself to the listening audience out there and let them know a little bit about yourself and how you wound up in such a weird profession as we have in the mental health industry?
Sure. My name is Susan Trachman. I am a psychiatrist, but I also do many people call themselves forensic psychiatrists just because they like to do legal work. But I actually did one of my 2 fellowships in forensic psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm actually board certified in forensic psychiatry. Most of the work that I do, however, and how I make most of my living is as a general psychiatrist. So I see people in my office, and I also have academic appointments. So I teach medical students and residents and post-residency fellows. But with respect to the forensic work, I think I fell into it because I've always been interested in the law. And at one time I thought I might go to law school. This is also after I had graduated from medical school, but I had small kids and a full-time practice, and it didn't seem feasible for me to do that, except maybe at night, which means I would never sleep, which is never a good thing.
And you're saying you were smart enough to have self-care at that point in your career? Oh my gosh.
I tried to rein it in a bit. So I decided not to go to law school, even though I did study for the LSAT, but never sat for it. My son ended up becoming a lawyer, so I don't want to tread on his turf at all. But so in lieu of that, I decided to do after I was already a practicing psychiatrist, I looked into what are called forensic psychiatry fellowships. Many of them are full-time. I could not do that because, like I said, I had young kids and I had a full-time practice. So I commuted to Philadelphia once a week and did like full days at the University of Pennsylvania. Was fortunate enough to have someone who was a really excellent mentor there, Robert Sadoff, who was wonderful and one of the big names in forensic psychiatry then. So I think there's a misnomer in the general public when they hear forensic psychiatry. They think I deal with dead people, which I don't. I do not deal with dead people. And what forensic psychiatry means is that I do work with the legal system. So there are 2 components to the legal system. There's the civil side, which is generally when people are bringing what are called torts or suits for some kind of damage. And there's the criminal side, and that's probably what people think is maybe even more exciting, which is what,
So it's all pretty much all serial killers and visits to Hannibal Lecter, I think, is what.
Well, Hannibal, you can call him what you want, but I guess he was a pretty well-known forensic psychiatrist. I mean, he was a psychiatrist. His character
I forgot.
Anyway.
He wasn't
His
just studied. He was
a psychiatrist. However, he also did some forensic work because if you remember, he helped Clarice solve her case. So
there's always it's always good to see some rehabilitation going on in prison.
Yeah. So he was actually a practicing forensic psychiatrist / serial killer who had his office in a cell in jail in Baltimore. So most of us don't do that. Hopefully none of us do that. Being serial killer.
Right. I was about to ask with all seriousness. So it's not really like that then. What I meant was what the question was going to mean was, I think do you find a lot of people think like Mindhunter and all that jazz when they hear about it? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, when people come, my business card says board certified in general psychiatry and forensic psychiatry. So when I have a new patient in the office who sees my business card, they're like, oh, you're also a forensic psychiatrist? I'm like, yeah, but this is what it means.
They're like, which one are we going to do?
Right. Now,
do you know something I don't? Am I not going to make it?
To be honest, I have done some work on the criminal side. Not that I was a criminal, but I examined people who were criminals, for
We don't
example.
judge on the show. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So capacity to stand trial, for example.
Yeah.
Um, I really have not done a quote insanity case, meaning determining if someone was sane because most people honestly are perfectly fine to stand trial. That defense fails most of the time. The only time it works is in cases like, Ted Kaczynski, where they didn't want to have a trial because it was very costly to the government, and they just, made a deal and admit that you did it, and okay, you don't get the death penalty. But more often than not, I think my last look at the statistics is the insanity defense is only successful in 1% of the times, which means 99% of the time it fails. So it's not used very often.
That's interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I knew enough to know that not many people do it, but I
Mhm.
did not know that it's such a small amount of success, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Well, because there's a lot to prove. I mean, if you're a defense attorney, even if you're working with a forensic psychiatrist like me, I mean, there's a lot to prove. Most criminals who are successful have intent, which means, and that's part of the key is, did you know what you were doing at the time of the crime? And if it looks as though you did some planning, and I guess if you were successful at it, you must have done some planning. Rather than a random killing, for example, as a contrast, you probably could not qualify for that defense.
It reminds me of an old episode of The Simpsons, funny enough, which is a real
I'm a
intelligent
big
thing
fan of The
for me.
Simpsons.
Oh, hey, there works.
Big fan.
We're already kindred spirits.
Oh yeah, big fan.
It's the one where I think it's the one where they're doing the kids news show or whatever. But anyway, Willie, the janitor, gets enraged at Bart, and he's chasing him with like a car bumper or something. He's trying to kill him. And Lisa tries to stop him, and he just says, "No, I got to kill him now while I'm still temporarily insane."
Yeah, but you see, that already shows judgment.
That already is,
which
yes.
means forget it. He would not qualify for that defense.
Right. Yeah, because it's not just having some problems or having mental health diagnoses or qualifying for psychological diagnoses. It's an actual detachment, right, from right and wrong. And
But there's a legal statute. So when people say insane, they think, oh, this person's crazy. Of course they can't be responsible. You can have a major psychiatric diagnosis. I mean, Ted Kaczynski probably is a paranoid schizophrenic, which is a serious mental illness. However, you can also be sane at the time of your crime in the letter of the law. The letter of the law basically means is, did you know what you were doing? Did you know what the consequences are? Can you participate in your defense? Do you know who an attorney is? Do you know who the judge is? Do you know why we're in the courtroom? I mean, those are pretty simple questions to answer. Ted Kaczynski is a brilliant man. Aside from being a serial killer, he is probably brilliant, as was, whose name is escaping me, the guy who was the lawyer and killed co-eds, Ted Bundy.
Oh, right. Bundy. Yeah. There you go.
Ted Bundy was probably intellectually fairly gifted, and was perfectly sane at the time he killed all those women.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's a lot different than people think in that way. That's interesting. And so which kinds of things, when people say forensic, then it just means legal?
Yeah, it just means that you do overlap with the legal system. There are some psychiatrists and psychologists, for example, who are appointed by the court, and they are paid by the court. And when someone is needing of a psychological evaluation, the court pays for the evaluation, and that practitioner would then testify in court as to their findings. Being a private practitioner, I am not employed by the court. When I get hired, it's usually by a company who's being sued for employment harassment or wrongful termination, or it's an attorney who's got a case that they want someone to evaluate psychological damages.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. And so you've delved into some of that with the criminal side of things, and you say mostly it's not evaluations, it's more, it sounds like expert testimony, looking at records and things. Or
Well, sometimes it's looking at records, but more often than not, it's looking at records and then evaluating either the claimant in a tort case. I mean, one time I did have to go to the jail to evaluate someone who was incarcerated. It was actually it was considered a federal case, so it was tried in the Eastern District because it involved a kidnapping and a murder. Anytime it involves a kidnapping across state lines, it becomes a federal case. That was quite interesting for me. That's the one and only federal case I've ever done.
That's fascinating. And so you did get to have that Clarice moment, sort of. And
Well, yeah. I mean, he wasn't as interesting as Hannibal Lecter. I mean, he was basically a career criminal who had tricked somebody and kidnapped them and then killed them.
Okay.
But he was perfectly competent to stand trial. And I don't recall what the sentence was because I wasn't at his trial. But yeah, I wrote a letter to the judge, who's actually still sitting on the bench, remarkably. But yeah, it was a very interesting experience for me.
Yeah, no, it must be to get a little bit of insight into those. I know when I've learned a lot about the legal system, even just working with clients with addiction, right? Because of all that they've been through. And you got there's some eye-opening moments where you're like, wow, different things that go on one way or the other, on both sides, right?
Oh, I'll bet.
Those enforcing it and those receiving that enforcement. So have you done civil work then as well?
Yeah, most of the work that I do in forensics is on the civil side. So it would include things like employment litigation, people who are suing for either harassment, whether it be sexual harassment, whether it be a coercive workplace, for example, or wrongful termination, or it would be another example would be sometimes it involves wrongful death in medical cases. One of the saddest two of the saddest cases. One was someone who was operated on by a physician who had forged the record, and he told her she could never get pregnant. And she was having gynecologic problems. They determined that they would do a hysterectomy. He failed to do a pregnancy test, and only after was determined that she was in fact pregnant. And so it was obviously a malpractice case, which was very sad. Another really sad one that I did was a wrongful death. It was a woman with a significant, not just postpartum depression, but postpartum psychosis, who killed herself in the course of that. And unfortunately, there was a cross-covering psychiatrist on call when she was having her crisis who didn't recognize the severity of the situation. And so that was a wrongful death case. Very sad. But more often than not, it's things like, employment cases. One that comes up quite often, and I guess it's worth talking about, is the whole diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I once wrote a chapter about this in a book on, I can't remember the name of the book. It was a compendium book about courtroom testimony. I like to call post-traumatic stress disorder a defense attorney's nightmare, because it's hard to defend against unless you have somebody who knows what they're doing to go in there and make the determination. Because, as you know, being a practitioner yourself, it's a self-report diagnosis. So if you know what all the symptoms are, you can report, yeah, I had this, yeah, I had this, yeah, I had this. So that's one issue. The second issue is, I think that we toss around that diagnosis quite liberally when it doesn't apply. And that's not just in the mental health field, that's in other medical fields, primary care doctors, orthopedic surgeons. I mean, I've seen in documents, because I've read, I can't even tell you how many pages of medical records in these cases, where they'll like say, okay, a person had this accident, diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, which, I'm sure is not true, in that you can experience a horrific traumatic situation, and in only about 25 to 30% of the cases would you actually go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the statistic, which means that most people, even in horrific situations, do not.
There's Yeah. No, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was going to say, and yet that is really one of the most common kinds of things that cross my desk when it comes to, forensic exams.
Is it used usually as a defense tactic to sort of try to ameliorate the way it's being looked at? So the defense would use it as a way to mitigate? That's the word I was looking for, to mitigate the consequences.
It's actually more often than not, it's the plaintiff.
Really?
So I was in a motor vehicle, not me, I was in a motor vehicle accident. I had a whiplash injury. I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I need to be compensated for that.
Oh, that's right. I guess
Yeah.
my brain flashed into criminal again, but
Yeah.
yes, no, totally. That makes way more sense. I just need to know what's going on around me at any given moment, which is often a challenge for me. But no, but that makes a lot of sense. And, the other thing people don't think about when it comes to PTSD is, and I'm going to go off the top of my head with my memory here. I haven't looked it up in a while, but I believe it's 6 months. There's a diagnostic criteria that's like, before you can even say it's PTSD, it has to be like 6 months that have elapsed. You can say it's PTS, right? Everybody has PTS. Not everybody has PTSD. Everyone gets some stress from post-trauma or following a traumatic experience. But for it to really form into that, you're right. It's a minority of the cases.
It is.
I think I'd be interested to see what you think about this. I have a little theory about trauma. I think we're talking about trauma a lot more, have been for years in the field, taking what they call a trauma informed approach. I feel like sometimes what people miss out on is the real exciting thing about that, in my mind, is the trend to evaluate trauma as a continuum, that even if you don't have PTSD, we can utilize trauma in treatment, right? We can utilize trauma in trying to, here's something that complicates your depression and complicates your abuse recovery. And whether or not you qualify for PTSD, that's there. But I think sometimes people, when we're in the mindset, which frankly is also a clinical mindset, when you work with insurance, you have to have a diagnostic code. So we're trained to say, we're sort of, I say trained, socially trained to say, trauma, great car. Okay. Yeah. Abuse, PTSD, without even investigating to see what's the role of the trauma without the full diagnosis. I don't know. What are your thoughts about?
I agree with you. I think that at first of all, I think that, the experience of trauma is different for everyone. And, your predisposition or your pre-trauma, psychological makeup has a lot to do with it. So, I think you and I probably both know that, there's certain things that would predispose you to be more likely to have a post-traumatic stress disorder. One would be, a series of traumas, for example. It's cumulative, as are, concussions. Having been a victim or experienced any kind of abuse in childhood would put you at risk. Having other types of psychiatric diagnoses, for example, having a pre-existing anxiety disorder might put you at risk. And then there are some people, quite honestly, you put them in the most horrific situation. Like I'm thinking about, the concentration camps during World War II. To know that not 100% of those victims had PTSD, and what could be worse, right? Or prisoners of war during the Vietnam War. I'm thinking about this recent experience of the Hurricane Ian, which is horrific. People losing everything, people dying, people seeing people die. There are not going to be 100% of people who survive that who get PTSD for whatever reason. So everyone's sort of built differently psychologically, just like everyone's built differently, physically.
Yeah. We had I had a psychologist who specialized in burnout for people who work for like NGOs and other charities in third world nations, and talked about burnout and trauma and PTSD and different symptoms. And it was very interesting to talk about the studies of resilience, right? That so many people have a different form of resilience.
I agree.
Now, it was real interesting there because she mentioned she had been asked to come up with testing to weed. Some organization said, could we weed it so that we have only high resilience people? And she was like, well, those people also score high on stubbornness. Some of them tend to score high on narcissism. If you're a more hard
and independence. And independence.
Person, yes. You don't want to, she said, you're going to want a few of those. You're going to want like some kind of a 70-30 split in your office, but it's a charity, remember.
Right. Everyone can't be a leader. There got to be some followers, right? Exactly. Not everyone can be a chief. You got to have some Indians.
Yeah. So I know that's an interesting thing to see. Then the most common would be in those cases, do you get to talk to the plaintiff themselves?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I always ask. Now, more often than not, the answer is yes. Every once in a while, particularly if I'm working for defense and it's a plaintiff, sometimes they'll like, no, my client will not come in. And so I have to document that and just base it on what I've got. A recent case that I had where I could not see the claimant, was a case in which a woman had been allegedly assaulted in her apartment a number of years prior and was examined 3 or 4 times by someone else I know who's a forensic psychiatrist who I've often gone up against in litigation. And she's always on the plaintiff's side, this particular person, this psychiatrist. And when she writes her reports, she thinks she's an attorney. So she like writes a brief. She's not an attorney, but she writes like it's going to intimidate somebody. So she, she writes her reports like they're a brief, with footnotes. And I mean, I've seen enough briefs and my son's a lawyer. So I mean, I know what these things look like. And more often than not, when I go through her stuff, I find lots of mistakes. So she'll claim, because they always have post-traumatic stress disorder as far as she's concerned. They're always victims of trauma. If I go through the physical documents, they often don't match up with what she's stating. And so I would go, but she'll cite literature and X% of patients, if they're not better by this time, they're never going to get better, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, you go back into her report and you say that, yeah, but her data is like 10 years old. So you look at something more recent, you say, yes, but, and then it gets worse. Then she comes back with a rebuttal. So it's like fighting a legal case without having to see the claimant.
So you have so there's kind of dueling forensic experts here a little bit to some, which actually makes sense, as you're saying.
There's only one that I've come up against.
Oh, okay.
Because lawyers like to call me when she's going to be on the other side. Because
like, well, mom said I could. It's like one of those I've had a few instances where I've worked with people who had multiple therapists for members of their family, and very, very rarely, but sometimes people like to come and say, well, the other therapist said this was healthy. The other therapist said I don't drink too much or whatever. It just depends, but that's very interesting. So you're having, and maybe it's only in this rare case, but then are you often having to review and respond to the findings of the plaintiff's expert? Is that would be a normal part of it, right?
I think that's totally.
Here's why I think they're wrong.
Yes, and I totally expect that when my reports are reviewed by the other side, they're going to probably find something. Maybe they'll find something they agree with, but maybe they'll find something they don't agree with, which is why, that's why it's different being a forensic psychiatrist than being a regular psychiatrist, because anyone can say they do forensic work. But if you've been trained in forensic psychiatry, you know how to write a report so that you're not speculating. You can't speculate. Like, in our practices, when we're like therapists or whatever, we assume that what someone tells us is true, right? Unless proven otherwise.
Sure. It doesn't. Yeah, no, I've seen it the other way when I worked in outpatient substance abuse, and you had some old school hardened, kick-ass alcohol and drug counselors who were like, oh, you can tell they're lying if their lips move. And they all sound just like that. But that doesn't work in therapy, really, in my experience, right?
Right. So we'd like to be, we'd like to be accepting, we'd like to generally believe what someone tells us unless proven otherwise. When you're writing a forensic report, it's just the opposite. You don't believe anything unless you have documentation that it's actually true. So someone says to you, yeah, I have this, 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 and this. Okay, who else knows? Who else can I ask? Where else is it documented? And if it's not, we need to find a place that it is, because I can't just assume that you tell me it's true because you tell me it's true. One time I said, I'll just tell you a funny story. One time I had someone who was claiming that he had nerve damage in a hand as a result of an accident at work. And it sounded like an awful accident. And so when we were, when I was examining him, I had a feeling that this guy was not really on the level. And so I said, okay, if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you to just fill out a couple of questionnaires for me, if you don't mind. And so I handed it to him. And of course, he picked it up with the hand that was supposedly damaged. No, I didn't do it to be nasty. I did it to support a hypothesis. That doesn't always happen.
It sounds like one of those things you see on like a cop show or something where they like toss something to the person.
It was pretty funny. I wasn't going to throw the clipboard at him. I was going to hand it to him.
Right. But it's like, dude.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I assume that probably just makes it into the report, but I don't know if that become a discussion point right then? Like, dude, come on.
And I said, oh, no, I didn't want to confront him then. I wanted to see if I could gather some more information. But yes, that interaction definitely made it into the report. And he lost, by the way. He lost.
I would imagine. Yeah, that couldn't have helped him in that case when you're clearly manufacturing your injury. It's interesting how you talk about that with the court. when I worked a lot with the child and family systems, and I used to work with like Department of Child and Family Services and
Mhm.
people that were trying to do reunification for family.
Mm.
And or when I've had people who are a kid tells me they were abused and we have to report it. And
Yeah,
a lot of times you have someone come back around in a divorce proceeding or in where they're trying to get their kids custody, or the state wants to whatever. And you get people
right,
who want you to say all kinds of things that are like, hey, say how much this is damaged. And it's like, well, and say that this happened and that happened and this happened. And it's like, well, I can write you a letter that says you came to therapy.
mhm,
Your kid told me this on this date.
right,
Your kid does have these symptoms, but I can't really even say, I can say it's consistent with trauma or abuse survival, but I'm not going to say it caused it, because that's
good,
all you need is an attorney, right? To come in
right.
and say, how do they know that? Yeah, never mind. Rip
Well,
that
see
up.
that, yeah, I mean, that shows how legitimate you are, because, you won't do that.
That's one of the
There's
few
plenty of
ways I
there's
was trained well. No, I'm just
no,
kidding.
there's
I
plenty
was
of
trained by
therapists
some
who
good
will.
people. Yeah.
Seriously, there's plenty of therapists who it's like, yeah, of course, sure.
Do you think it helps that, because I've always credited my I guess fastidiousness and stuff like that, and not to my own nature, because I am not fastidious. Anyone who listens to the program will be like, what is he talking about?
Mhm.
But I was trained by nurses mostly, right?
Ah,
Because my first job was in inpatient care, so
sure,
we
yeah,
had doctors reading our reports and nurses mostly like chasing around being like, you do not misspell this, you do
right,
not,
right,
because of course that's life or death for a nurse. um does it help that, I mean, you're an MD, right?
yeah,
That's your background. Does it help that
yes.
you have that training? Is it better than some people who just come in, like somebody like me who just has maybe gone through a master's degree in psychology, or even a psychologist? Is it different? What are your thoughts about
Well,
that?
I think when it comes to like a forensic case, as long as you have forensic training, I don't think it matters whether you're an MD or PhD or a master's degree person. But back to your point of nurses, I mean, honestly, nurses kept me going during my internship and residency, and I am grateful to them. And when my own child, who's now a doctor, started medical school, I said, just remember, nurses are gods and goddesses. They can be your best friends or your worst enemies. So you treat them as though they are on a pedestal, because they work like dogs. They keep
Yeah.
patients alive.
And they're the ones, I mean, you think about any interactions you have with the healthcare system, especially
Mhm.
in any meaningful way,
Yeah.
that's like more than just a checkup. They're doing all the stuff, even just a checkup. You're seeing them most of the time, you know.
In some cases, yeah. I mean, I don't have any nurse practitioners. I see patients myself, but I know that
Mhm.
there are psychiatrists who have nurse practitioners that work with them that do screening, and the doctors just do medication. I mean, I don't practice that way, but I know some people do.
Yeah. No, it's gotten weird. Well, we have a still, right, shortage nationally of
Mm,
psychiatrists in general, right? I mean, in
yeah,
my area, we have a lot of nurse practitioners who just have their own practice because
right,
they
right.
go and get that training because there's a dearth of psychiatric specialists.
That is true. I was actually asked that question this morning on another podcast is, why do I think there's a mental health crisis? I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. But one is that there's not enough of us to go around. And I think there's several reasons there are not enough of us to go around. One is not enough people go into psychiatry coming out of medical school. Um, and I think that one of the reasons for that is people graduate with a lot of debt. I mean, my own daughter is going to graduate with a lot of debt. And people think that if you go into psychiatry, you're not going to ever make enough money to pay back your loans. Yeah, I was very fortunate in that, I mean, I do fine, but I think most psychiatrists may not do that well. And, there's a fear that, God, I graduate with all this debt, I can't go into psychiatry. The second reason is, reimbursement for mental health care is really not on parity with that of other kinds of health care. And if you think about mental health versus physical health, as I was asked this morning, that's absurd and arbitrary. I mean, if I cut your head off, could you function? Of course not. So to think about mental health versus physical health, we just need to think about overall health.
This is,
And
I love hearing people say this because I've been beating that drum for a long time,
yeah,
that there is no physical versus mental. Your brain is an organ that's contained in your
yes,
body. It's all physical. Yeah.
absolutely. And there's just not enough parity for those who practice. And, depending upon, again, rural areas, I'm not sure exactly where you practice, but, there's a shortage of psychiatrists anyway, but particularly in rural areas, there's shortage of physicians. And so they are training nurse practitioners and physician's assistants to do some of the work,
Mhm.
which can be a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, if they're good
Well,
and they're competent, that's great. But if they're
yeah.
not competent, like someone that I just unfortunately interacted with, then that's a bad thing. Because I had to report that person to the board of nursing because they had a person come in addicted to 10 milligrams of Xanax a day. Because this person had no clue how to prescribe an antidepressant. It's easier to prescribe Xanax.
That's the problem. Yeah. And getting
Yeah,
some kind of like, I know psychologists have fought for prescription rights
yeah.
for a long time. And man, I've always thought there's got to be some pretty rigorous training if you really want to advocate that for
Yeah, go to
someone.
medical school if you want to prescribe.
Right.
Go to nursing school.
I mean, yeah, exactly. And once again, you get nurses a lot of times. That's the thing I do like about APRNs and some of those is that they came up as nurses, and
Mhm.
and maybe a lot of doctors didn't. So that's an advantage sometimes with bedside manner,
I
especially.
think so.
Um, now, I shouldn't say that to an MD. Oh my gosh, you're gonna hang up on
No
me.
offense. Listen, there's plenty of doctors I wouldn't go to because they have terrible bedside manner.
And I practice it's a fairly suburban to it's becoming a little more urban in some areas, but suburban area. I'm in Utah, and
Oh,
oddly enough, now you're in Pennsylvania, which is where I
nope,
grew up.
I'm in Virginia.
Oh no, you were in Pennsylvania doing
I did
your
my
training.
fellowship at Penn, but no, I
Okay.
practiced in Northern Virginia, just outside of DC.
Oh, that's where that's where my sister lives and her
Mhm.
family. So, just not to put my sister on blast, but say hi if you run into her. So, I think that's absolutely. I see that around here where people get on waiting lists forever and ever and ever,
Yeah.
and then it's like, wow, to really get into a specialist,
Hmm.
and I think that's where you run into some of these. Going back to what you were saying about where's the diagnosis, I'm always surprised how many people have when I meet them, I'll say, have you ever been in therapy before? No. Have you ever
Hmm.
taken psychiatric meds before?
Yeah.
Yes. That's not uncommon, but then it's like sometimes it's
Right.
kind of a complicated diagnosis they just got from a non-specialist, frankly,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So interesting. Huh. Well, I wanted to also I think we're feeding right into it here when we talk about trauma and we talk about people's understanding of that. But this whole COVID, you may have
Yeah.
heard of. A lot
Yeah.
of listeners out there familiar,
Once or twice. Uh-huh.
and some of the psychological damage that has been done. I mean, I kind of feel like everybody I know is walking around with some level of trauma, whether it's, just that little bit of like, man, that was rough, all the way up to like, I don't know if I can go back to school or whatever,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
see. What are some of the things that you've observed in that?
Well, there's a lot of things. So one is the virus itself. So coronavirus is what we call, a neurotoxic virus, meaning it likes to attack the brain. And so in my practice, even early on when this pandemic started, we were seeing cases of people who presented with new onset depression and anxiety with no prior history and a recent diagnosis of COVID. Now, we know, in fact, that any kind of virus can cause changes in brain chemistry, even the flu. So it's not uncommon for folks, myself included. I remember when I had mononucleosis as a college student, who got very depressed after that. Didn't last long, which was good, but with no prior history to develop new onset psychiatric diagnosis, even to the point of I had to evaluate someone that one of my friends who's a child psychiatrist asked me to see, a teenager who new onset psychosis with no
Mm,
prior history
wow.
after a COVID infection. So there's the infection itself. Then there's the fear that was placed before there was immunization. Like people just didn't know, like, what's going to happen. Are we going to all die? You saw the bodies piling up on CNN. They were like in these makeshift morgues outside the hospitals in New York. So the fear. Then there was all the false rumors being spread around, like you should take, bleach. Thank you, Donald Trump. Inject yourself with bleach
Right.
or infrared waves or whatever. So the fear, the false information, um, the isolation, big time. Isolation for 2 years. And the folks who were really, really compromised were kids in school.
Mm,
Because these are kids who, particularly kids who had any kind of learning problems or ADD, they could not function on a screen for hours at a time. And a lot of those kids were becoming anxious and depressed, and their parents were calling the child psychiatrist day and night to try to get an appointment. But even for the college students that I treated, just imagine yourself as a first semester freshman in a dorm room on lockdown. You don't have a normal freshman experience. You don't get to meet people. You're isolated in your room. You're learning online, which when maybe you don't learn particularly well online. You can't go anywhere. You try telling a teenager they can't do things. And high incidence of depression and anxiety.
Yeah. And you look at that, that's already the time of life where a lot of psychiatric conditions emerge for the first time, right? With like
Right.
OCD
Correct.
and depression, very, very
Yes.
common in early 20s.
Yes.
It's already a high risk time for suicide and all those. And
Yes.
yeah. And the other thing, a couple of things I think too that people don't necessarily talk about as much, which is the compounding frustration. I mean, take college, for example. I saw several tweets made by college students that were like, hey, you know, I signed up and I may paid a significant amount of money or gone through applications for scholarships. And
Right.
my first year has been pretty lousy,
Right.
as far, because especially when they had to just turn on a dime. And hey, you know, all respect to all the educational institutions who were told you have a week to be 100% online.
Right.
But the sentiment was, am I going to get any money back for this? And it's just a question, right? And can I
Right.
ask that
Right.
question without being called entitled,
Sure.
like the young generation always is anyway? Or you've got people who had economic loss, and I've had clients who, man, they enrolled in the economic bill pay programs and they
Yeah.
got their mortgage payments, maybe stayed for a few months. And then when it started to like not be to where companies would look so bad in the news, they started getting foreclosure notices.
Oh,
Hey, you
God.
didn't pay your bill. There was fine
Yeah.
print where you didn't
Yeah.
really, you know,
Mhm.
we didn't really have to do that, by the way. It was in the fine print that we can change our mind retroactively. And luckily, I don't know a ton of people in that situation, but
Mhm.
there's a lot of these secondary experiences that came because of the crisis, right?
I agree. Yeah. I mean, I think, and yeah, we didn't even get into the financial impact of this. You know, people who are, people who had to go to work, because you don't work, you don't get paid, you can't live. So people are having to go to work sick.
Mhm.
You know, people were dying. Then people maybe who weren't going to work, but the fact is the bills keep coming, right? Like and there was not a moratorium on bills, not right
Yeah.
away. And then trying to get one of those, I'm trying to remember the name of them. It's been a while. What was that? PPP loans,
Oh,
uh,
right. That they made the
right?
news sure made it sound like those were easy to get.
Well, they were not easy to get. There's a
Yeah.
lot of paperwork, and if you're not well educated, or if you don't speak English as as your first language, those were not easy to get. So there's another impact on one's mental health, not knowing whether, you know, you're going to be able to, are you going to get evicted? Like you said, like your clients, or are you going to get evicted? Are you going to be able to get food? Then remember the food shortage and the shortages of everything in the grocery
Yeah.
stores. It's like, oh my God, where's everything going? Right. And the supply chain issues.
Well,
Uh,
I wonder how much of the kind of the employee crisis is, you know, people talk about depression, anxiety, trauma. People won't go back or don't go back for some of those reasons.
mhm,
I think that's true. I think there's
mhm.
burnout, but also we don't always. It's a little dark, but you know, to have so many people that have died means that
Right.
there are less people to hold down jobs, and also
Right.
people in significant grief.
Right. Right.
And
Right. You know, I think the further we get from the pandemic, it's going to be easier to forget that, what was it? Was it closing in on 1 million people who died? Or maybe it did hit 1 million. It was real close.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think, and then at the same time, the last couple of years, we've seen skyrocketing numbers of overdose and fentanyl poisoning as
Hmm.
the street drugs have become more dangerous, and
Right.
people's triggers to use have gone up as well, because
Right.
it wasn't a great time to try to get off of heroin during the pandemic either. Well, let me say, it's always a good time to stop using heroin if you can, but
Right.
you know, to go into DTs and withdrawals at home alone without being able to get a medical appointment, not
Well,
a great
I mean,
time.
not nearly as worse as your situation that you were describing, but there's a reason that liquor stores were considered essential businesses.
Yes.
They had to stay open.
Yeah. Yeah. And people underestimate that. I produce a podcast by there's an outfit in California called the Wiseman Method. They do rapid detox and set
Mm,
people up for treatment and
okay.
help them organize how to get clean.
Yeah.
And so they do a weekly or bi-weekly podcast, and we've talked a lot on there about how there were even programs in some cities to deliver alcohol to some people just so they wouldn't go through the DTs.
Go through
Yeah.
withdrawal. Yeah. Yeah. Which can be life threatening. People don't
Yeah.
realize that, but it really can be life threatening.
Interesting. When you see that, well, I wonder if this intersects too a little bit, because you see not only the trauma, but you see the, I don't know, criminal behavior probably goes up too. I just thought of that because of the
Well,
forensic.
not during COVID, because nobody was going out.
That's true. No one was going out. They were all
No,
committing crime.
it was probably online criminality, ways to
Sure.
keep people online. But I don't think there's street crime. I think went down actually.
That's true. Crime at home went up. I mean, domestic violence and such.
Yes, child abuse,
But,
spousal abuse, absolutely. Yes.
Wow. What about, I'm curious, circling back a bit here to when we talked about the levels of trauma.
Yeah.
I would not say that that most people walking around have PTSD from the pandemic necessarily, but there's a lot of PTS. There's post-traumatic stress going around that may not make that diagnosis. What are your thoughts about levels of trauma, levels of stress from that?
From COVID, you mean?
The whole crisis.
Well, I think what I can speak to is the medical people who had to work in the hospitals during the crisis and having to care for people who were dying, because we didn't really know what to do for them in the beginning. So there were more people were dying than surviving, and to have particularly again nurses, holding the phone so that these people could say their goodbyes to their families because they were not going to make it and the families couldn't come in. Yeah. I think probably the on-site healthcare folks, I don't know what the statistic is, but my suspicion would be those were the people most at risk for PTSD. Yeah. Or watching potentially someone die at home who's never going to be able to get to the hospital. I think potentially caretakers like that would probably be at higher risk. I think just working in the hospital, even though it was scary and you had to, take all kinds of precautions, I don't think the rate, as far as I've seen, I don't know if that rate has gone up.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we know that since then there's been not only a national, at least in the United States, as they've measured, people are dissatisfied with their careers in general.
Right.
And there's also, though, in medical practice, I think at least we had Dr. Tammy Chung come on a month or two ago, and she was talking about a 50% rate of burnout amongst mental health and medical professionals.
Yeah, I mean, she knows that stuff. I haven't read her material. I know who she is. I don't know her personally, but I do know who she is. And I would say, just from my own experience, I mean, just colleagues of mine, not necessarily even in psychiatry, but in other medical specialties, I have had a number of people retire this year, which they might have gone on another few years had it not been for this. But I think that the crisis just burned people out. For those of us in mental health, I mean, I never stopped working during the pandemic. I came to work, but I was on a screen as opposed to seeing people in person, which initially was exhausting. I don't know how you felt, but I found that more exhausting initially until I got used to it. But every day we get calls and people that we couldn't get in. And that in and of itself is stressful because these people are hurting, but there's only so many hours of the day and you can't clone yourself as much as you might like to. No one I knew had openings in their practice. No one.
Yeah, no, I had a slight advantage because I've been doing the podcast for years. And so I'm pretty used to doing online interviews and meetings and such. So I already had a little advantage, but yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're doing, you do a bunch of Zoom sessions a day, it really gets you in a way that having someone here live doesn't. Like, I feel like I can kind of move around a little more if someone's there. I can sit up in my chair. And whereas if I'm here, those of you listening to audio can't see me do this, but I feel like I'm doing this the whole time. I'm leaning down on the desk, and you probably can't even hear me as well. And I start drooping, and then I'm like, I pick myself back up. No, get to the camera. Forget the camera's there. Anyway.
Yeah, the only nice thing about it is I only had to look nice from the waist up. Right? Like I could be wearing like shorts. As long as I
did every day.
Up, I'd be okay.
Yes, every single day. I actually came to my office, and it had been long enough that I knew for sure no one had been in it but me. So I could just beeline to my office, kick my shoes off by the door, hand sanitize, and then I was
Right.
my little
Yeah.
zone.
Yeah, I dare not work from even though I have a little office in my house where I just do work but don't see patients. I dare not work from my house because I would just get too distracted. Plus I have too many four-legged animals that would be like walking across the screen or jumping up and wanting to be scratched. And
Yeah,
so
it's like animal therapy, sort of,
it is. It was
for you.
virtual animal therapy.
Yeah.
I mean, my patients always loved seeing them, but it's too distracting for me.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's interesting how people have adapted to it. I have some clients who still like it.
They do.
So,
Hmm.
and it's even more so when I have clients who are maybe high in ADHD
Hmm.
or something, and some of them don't like the camera, and so we'll just have a phone call, right?
Yeah.
True telehealth, and it's interesting playing off of my own ADHD, because then we're both, you can tell we're both like walking around. I'm pacing the office, moving around, which actually I'm a little more focused then. So it's interesting how it all works. Stuff in our profession that I never would have thought, right? Like, it's just, nope, you're here. Everything's like a teacher. You're here when you're here. The clients are here. You got to
Yeah.
be here. And it's like, it's a little different now, a little bit.
One thing I think that was a nice advantage though during COVID and seeing people in their environment, I could actually see what their environment looked like,
That's
right?
interesting. Yeah,
Right?
I
I
hadn't
could
thought
see
about
how
that,
they
but
were,
it's
I
true.
could see what the room looked like. I could see how they interacted with either an animal or a kid that would come in the room. I mean, you get some, additional information that way that you wouldn't otherwise.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It started a whole thing of like support groups and therapy groups online too,
Yeah.
to where you can have a much farther reach too. When someone's like, oh, I there's no support group in my area, but there is one in, I don't know, Tucson, and I
Yeah.
can join it through Zoom.
That's right. How many Zoom cocktail hours there were, right? Happy
Exactly.
hours. Uh,
D&D.
yeah, friends of mine college friends of mine who we would never talk that often. We decided we were going to have Zoom calls like twice a month. And it got to the point where it's like, okay, I can't do this anymore. I'm
We're
on
seeing
screen
each
all
other
day.
more than we used to. No.
No, I mean, they can do it, but I'm like, I'm on the screen all day. I'm not going to join at 7 o'clock
Right. That's
Tuesday
true.
night. Sorry, guys. I'll drop in when I can.
I guess that shows, that shows kind of the experiences. All your examples were classy. My example is D&D. Um,
No,
just
no.
kidding. Like, just joking. But with let me real quick ask you, what kinds of feedback do you have for people that might help with some of this stuff? Is there anything you work with your patients on? Obviously getting their medications correctly is important, is vital.
Mhm.
What other things do you think are good for people to do
With respect to what?
to overcoming and getting back into this
Okay.
we're not really post, I guess, but you know what I mean. This
Yeah, it's
more
going to be
socialized time.
this virus is going to be with us forever. But it's going to end up being like what the flu is. You're going to have to get a shot every year, and yes, you're going to be at risk, but if you practice proper, hygiene and precautions, you should be okay. But in terms of getting back into the real world, even when we were in COVID and people were struggling, routine is really important. I mean, what happens when people were working from home all the time? They would get up when they felt like it. They'd stay up late. They'd drink more because they didn't have to show up for work. They'd gain weight because they weren't like eating properly or going out to exercise. They weren't seeing friends. And then a lot of people got depressed. Well, what I would say to them, and I say now, because I think they're generally good practice for anyone, whether someone's depressed or not depressed, try to go to bed at a reasonable time. Try to get up at the same time. Limit how much alcohol you're using. Try to exercise at least 3 to 5 times a week. You don't have to be a marathon runner. I don't know what it's like in Utah, but it's beautiful out here today. Go out and take a walk for 20 to 30 minutes. You don't have to be like sprinting, even if you can't see a friend in person, call a friend, have a video chat with a friend, eat a healthy diet, try to limit, how much excess comfort food you're eating, even though it's nice to eat comfort food when you don't feel good. Do that for a few days. It's okay. Do that for a long time. And you've heard about the 15 to 20 pound COVID gain, right?
Absolutely.
So we don't want to see an increase in diabetes as a result of COVID because people are putting on too much weight. As I said, these are just kind of common things are common. They're not genius ideas. They're things that I think maybe our mothers or grandmothers were even telling us, try to eat a healthy diet, try to get enough sleep, For some people, I suggest, meditating if just to help calm themselves. For some people, it's getting a massage. But humans are social beings in general. Some people are hermits, some people are isolates. They prefer to be alone. Don't bother me. But most of us are not like that. So some type of human contact, even if it means like this, like a video chat, at least you and I are having a connection, right? And it'd be more fun to see you in person. But you know what I mean? Even if you're limited in terms of that, because people, oh, my family's so far away. All my friends all moved out of town. Yeah, but most people have a computer or a phone or or a cell phone. So, I mean, those would be the basic things that I would suggest.
Right. I like to ask people at the end if they have any nonprofits or a charity that they believe in that they would recommend people get to know better.
I'm a big supporter of the war in Ukraine, and so I have already prepaid. I support the World Central Kitchen by Jose Andres. He supplies hot meals to disaster areas around the
A
world.
documentary about that. It was fascinating.
He's a local chef here in DC, but I love the work that he does, and so I have a already prepaid donation for his group because I think what they do, what you pay for, it really goes there. With some of these non-profit, I worry about, like, for years I supported the Humane Society because I'm an animal lover. And then I heard bad things about where the money was really going. But I think with World Central Kitchen, it is going to feed people across the world.
On this thing that profiled him, it showed him like pulling out his own credit card, before people started donating money. He just went and started buying food.
Oh, I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did.
Yeah, it was wild and very inspirational. So thank you so much. And now one last thing is tell people where they can find you if they'd like to follow your work or learn more about you.
Absolutely. I would say my new website is going live October 9th. It's www.susanbtrachman.com. There's also going to be a take it yourself quiz to learn about how lots of medical conditions are influenced by your brain. It's a free quiz. The other way you can find me is I have a blog on Psychology Today, which is called It's Not Just in Your Head.
Oh, wonderful. It's not just in your head. Great. I like that. That was the reiteration of the name of that blog. Very cool. I'm going to have to check that out. I didn't know you had that.
That's great. I appreciate it.
Well, Dr. Trachman, thanks so much for being here. And thank you everybody out there for listening and being here today. We'll be back at you again soon with some more fascinating things. So make sure to get out there, find interesting things in the world and break your brain around those things.
Thank you.